Today I wanted to talk about the critically acclaimed PlayStation 4 video game called Nier Automata. And this channel is about talking about stories, so I'm not going to be talking about the visuals, the music, or the gameplay. Even though the visuals and the music went together hand in hand, were incredibly detailed, really made the game spectacular, and the gameplay was smooth. But we're going to be talking about the story. And unfortunately, this time we're not going to be talking about a particular strength the story had, but rather we're going to be talking about story problems. I want to talk about two things that Nier Automata did and could have done better. First, I want to talk about Nier Automata's stories being archetypal or too cliche. Nier Automata is filled with small stories. It's a game where there are many side quests and there's main quests as well. Throughout the side quests and in the main quest, we see stories that are very archetypal. You would see a machine, in this case, trying to become beautiful so that someone recognizes her. Or you would see a cult where the leader has died and thus has thrown the cult into turmoil. And this is done. This is done relatively well in some respects. There are scenes in Nier Automata where they wrap these incredibly archetypal stories in a language of myth. You get to see almost machine-like tribal paintings and representations of these stories, as well as almost a childlike narration via 9S. Now, this is wonderful. However, when you're trying to represent archetypal stories in reality, when you're trying to ground them in reality, they need to be different from the myth. There needs to be some nuance to them. Just to take some archetype, some story, and transplant it with literally no nuance or literally no subtlety into reality makes for some very, very bland storytelling. And I found that many of the stories that Nier Automata tried to portray seemed to fall in this paradigm, where the archetype was presented and it was wrapped in a language of myth, which was lovely, and it sort of cast this sort of overarching shadow on top of the story. However, the shadow itself was all you got. You didn't fill in any of the details. There was no nuance. Unfortunately, the machines in this story simply played exactly to the archetype, which maybe is what the authors want, but after hearing this again and again and again, it becomes rather boring. The second problem, or the second opportunity to do better, that I think Nier Automata had was that it had beginnings and endings of the arcs, but was unsure of how we'd go from the beginning to the end. The beginnings of Nier Automata, as well as the ends, were incredible. For me, I thought they were pretty moving, especially some of the endings. We would end up with characters dying. We would end up with real impact, which I think a lot of stories fail to deliver on. And the beginnings of the stories I thought were quite good. We were left with characters that were definitely lacking something. So it did seem like we were set to go on something along the lines of a hero's journey. However, our beginning, our start of the journey to the end of the journey made me feel lacking. And perhaps this is best exemplified through describing a story in the game. So I want to talk a little bit about the Pascal storyline. And there are other storylines that I believe follow this exact trend. So Pascal was a machine that preached nonviolence, unlike many of the other machines. And it starts off with quite a powerful beginning. This is a machine that's surrounded by violence that preaches nonviolence. There's a lot of interesting things that can sort of happen here. And it ends to jump to the ending scene. It ends with Pascal's death or his lobotomy. You're left with this choice, and so given this, you've got a character that is trying to make a society that's based around nonviolence in a world that is surrounded by violence, and he comes to this realization that he no longer wants to live in this world, or he wants to forget what's happened. There could be a lot of ways to get there, and a lot of ways that would be incredibly impactful, that would make us truly empathize with that ending. However, for me, I was just confused at how he even got there. When Pascal asked me to do this, the character in this case, to be, it didn't make any sense. I didn't really feel emotionally gripped at all. How we got there was Pascal and his village were afflicted with random acts of violence that seemingly couldn't have been prevented. It was as if hurricanes repeatedly washed upon his shores. He didn't change at all during these hurricanes. We got to know him just a little bit more. But there was no lesson. There was no tragic flaw. In the end, Pascal even resorts to violence to protect children, sort of the children of his village that he had saved, which should have been sort of a big moment in my mind. But it wasn't. It didn't feel like this was a build-up. It felt a little bit sudden. It felt a little bit out of character, but it didn't feel like the story had made it seem like Pascal was violating his core tenet. So the story ends basically by showing Pascal resorting to violence, returning back to the children he was trying to protect, and seeing the children seeing the children dead. They'd killed themselves because, in Pascal's words, Pascal had taught them fear, and after he left, they were afraid and thus had killed themselves. For some reason, this incredibly highfalutin, this very philosophical idea that Pascal should not have taught children to fear, lest they would go ahead and kill themselves in a bad situation. I think this sort of dragged away from the original story. For me, it was just completely unbelievable. It was silly, unfortunately. There's many ways to save this storyline. I think there's a couple of ways that could have been rather quick. One, Pascal could never have resorted to violence, and that would just be his tragic flaw. Perhaps the moral of this story was that nonviolence is something good, but violence and self-defense is sometimes necessary. But that was not said. That was certainly not the moral that they wanted to portray here. Or perhaps when Pascal eventually resorted to violence, and you even see in his words as he leaves to go ahead and resort to violence that this was an emotional response. It was not a logical response. Perhaps if he left the children and they died because of that violence, right? So the amount of the fight that ensued created such destruction that the place collapsed, right? That would make a lot of sense. It would sort of lead into this story that we've been building upon. Instead, we just sort of get out of the blue that teaching fear. This is sort of the tragic flaw. This was the moral message that we were left with. This was sort of the end of this story. I feel like it came out of nowhere. So in my mind, there were the trappings of a great story, of something that I feel could be truly moving, have big impact, allow you to make some choices in this, and tell something that's worth telling again. But for me, the trappings of the great story did not surface. I loved Nier Automata. It was a great game. It truly was. The story had so many great parts that I feel like if you could tidy up just a bit, could really come together to make something wonderful. So for me, this game did not live up to the reviews that it had gotten, at least in the story regards. But it definitely had the pieces to make one. Thanks once again, and stay tuned for more. Subscribe if you like, and hit that like button if you do want to see more.